On December 13th, 2022, the U.S. Department of Energy held a press conference declaring that in 10 years, they aim to supply unlimited clean energy to all Americans. How? By harnessing the same phenomenon that powers the stars: nuclear fusion. But as Judy Greenwald, Executive Director of the Nuclear Innovation Alliance, explains in an April 2023 presentation, this goal is unfortunately not realistic because it neglects work on the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, or ITER, an international and intensely collaborative fusion project. As a massive project decades in the making, ITER has garnered substantial media attention, largely because of its role as a symbol of international academic unity in the fight to establish clean energy. As such, Greenwald argues that before we can make tangible progress in fusion, we need to finish building ITER. Failure to do so would prove that the international community's face of unity is largely a facade. So let's analyze fusion and its symbolic role in geopolitics. Today, we'll examine the historical context and current state of international collaboration and competition in fusion, before finally drawing some implications. Because with our environment in critical danger, those in power want to help, for all the wrong reasons. Now, when analyzing the geopolitics of fusion, the historical context is essential. We can divide it into two key phases: pre and post ITER. Now first, according to a 1987 analysis by physics historian Paul Foreman, fusion first found momentum in 1968, when the Soviet Union began to develop the technology. In a Cold War competitive spark, the US and UK increased domestic funding for fusion fivefold in the following decade, and competition motivated these big three to skyrocket their development. Enter none other than President Ronald Reagan and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. With such neoliberal girl bosses in power, economic tensions with the Soviet Union shifted from militaristic to ideological. Stanford University in March 2021 finds that in a Reaganomic effort, the US and UK left energy research to the private sector, and they followed the money to oil and gas. With minimized government intervention, the government's interest in funding fusion fell away, no longer motivated by competition with the USSR. But all hope was not lost. Just as the tension shifted, so did our era into our post-ITER phase. Now, according to ITER policy officer Michael Klesson's 2020 book, ITER, Bringing the Sun to Earth, the first Council for ITER met between the US, the EU, Russia, and Japan in 1988, 5 years after the idea was first proposed. And even then, their collaboration was reluctant. Amidst financial hesitance from each partner, everyone researching domestic projects, and conflict over where to build the machine, the final design was not finished until 2001. And since then, ITER has onboarded other members, such as India, South Korea, and China, yet progress remains disproportionately slow. From the beginning, fusion has been motivated by competition. And while collaboration is terrific in theory, it has been reluctant and even bitter in practice. Now that the stage is set, let's examine the modern state of nuclear politics. ITER serves as a fascinating case study today of this collaboration, competition, conflict in two key ways: its rhetoric about itself and how nations actually view the relationship. Now first, ITER's rhetoric about itself is uplifting in a way that approaches idealistic. For example, Politico of December 20th, 2022 interviewed Chief ITER engineer Alain Péculet. He indicates that after Russia invaded Ukraine, many members questioned its involvement, but they overcame the conflict, and Russia still plays a key role in the project today. Péculet highlights that this reveals the power of ITER's mission: international cooperation in pursuit of a global good, even in the face of political conflict. And this kind of unifying rhetoric is commonplace from ITER, as long as it's convenient. The Russia-Ukraine war has massive international attention. It's hard to ignore. Yet, as a member nation like China sanctions genocide against Uyghurs, ITER remains silent, disrobing their timidity and idealism, as well as their Eurocentrism. ITER's rhetoric about itself is encouraging, but for how long can they bottle up international attentions? And second, while ITER displays itself as a beacon of collaborative hope, many member nations see it as a means to an end, to establish global leadership. For example, Dr. Scott Su, fusion coordinator for the US Department of Energy, told CBS on October 20th, 2023, that the race to global fusion is also a race to global leadership. America aims to exemplify itself in the forefront of global technology by taking the lead in ITER, which it certainly is doing. Yet in the same breath, Dr. Su adds that America is focusing on public domestic projects to maintain private interest in fusion, giving the US a competitive stance in the world of fusion while still upholding Reaganomic values. In other words, the US's nuclear priorities are not in ITER or maintaining healthy competition between member nations. They're in maintaining the US's global hegemony. From these examples, it's clear that ITER may be a project to bring the world clean energy, but that is far from many member nations' primary motivations. And this should come as little surprise, given the historical reluctance in fusion collaboration. And today's seeming facade of fusion collaboration holds two key implications for climate change and for developing countries' research. But first, climate change. Judy Greenwald mentioned in her aforementioned presentation that we will not have fusion soon enough to prevent climate change, but we can use it to mitigate its effects. For example, American fusion startup Kronos explains on their website that when an area is afflicted by a natural disaster, we can provide relief and restore power by transporting temporary fusion reactors there. And nations that seek to appear as tech powerhouses will likely be happy to supply that energy, perhaps less out of altruism for the planet and more out of maintaining their status as technological leaders. This image of leadership, optimistically, serves as a motivator for nations to make good on fusion's environmental promise. And second, the involvement of developing countries in a potential fusion-driven future for a price. I interviewed Dr. Adele Wright, professor of fusion and science diplomacy. She indicates that the developing world, which often lacks research capital, is becoming more involved in energy research today. For example, China is funding Namibia and using abundant Namibian lithium deposits to involvement in energy storage research. And this shows just how gallant and leaderly China is. At least that's what China.org says. Reuters of October 23, 2023 shows that Namibia is certainly more empowered in research. Yet China is exploiting their resources and siphoning their precious lithium in a move of neocolonialism. Dr. Wright argues that when ITER comes online, we will soon see similar collaborations form in fusion, with the same benefits and the same drawbacks. We can only hope that as the developed world supposedly supports developing countries, that they give them their fair share of fusion energy. Because when climate change burns them the hardest, they need the most healing. Today, we've examined international collaboration and competition in nuclear fusion. From the historical context, current state, and implications of the geopolitics of fusion, we find that even though there is so much hope for the environment in fusion research, many nations act out of image preservation. So the next time we hear of a lofty goal like the Department of Energy's, we must remember that the motivations may not be what they seem.